Welcome everyone to our second session of the Iscia seminar series, Everything is Energy. And today we're joined by Anton Botha, who's going to talk to us a bit about the next step in this transition process, and a critical step it is in terms of how we store the energy that we're generating through renewables. And last week we spoke a bit about the South African situation and the sort of twin crisis we face, in the sense of load shedding, which we're not getting enough electricity, but at the same time, the world energy systems are changing away from fossil fuels to renewables. And the key thing about renewables is the inability to store energy at this point in time. And so that's something that Anton's going to be chatting to us through the session. Anton has 5 degrees. I'm not sure that we could list them all here and still stay within our time limits. He's currently studying towards his 6th. He's reading for a PhD at Durham University. He's worked within the United Nations system as a psychologist, or a people strategist, as they call it, for a decade or more, if I understand it. And he is also the founder of a company that does assessments within the UN environment, so psychological assessments and aptitude, and I imagine all that kind of stuff. But Anton's going to be talking to us today about the new Manhattan project, and he'll take you through what the old Manhattan project is as part of that. So Anton, without much ado, over to you.
Thank you very much, Gary and Andrea, and thanks for this opportunity to speak with all of you today. So as Gary mentioned, what I'm here to talk to you about today is really this idea of sort of a consolidated global approach to tackling energy storage problems. But before I get to the main argument, it might be interesting for you to know that, yes, I have quite a few degrees, but I mainly consider myself a psychologist. And by the end of the talk, it should become a little bit more clear why a psychologist is talking about energy storage. So just bear with me. But I'm sure all of you are aware of the IPCC report that came out. I think it was early this week on Monday it was launched. And the report by this intergovernmental panel was not great in terms of the warnings that it was issuing in terms of where we headed with climate change. I think the general consensus by this panel is that we have little more than a decade now to start making some drastic changes, or we are going to exceed this 1.5 centigrade temperature limit that we've set ourselves, and that will have dire knock-on effects for the globe and for humanity, and that's definitely something that we should try and avoid. And we seem to be speeding towards that. One thing else that I noted that was interesting in this report was that they made some suggestions in terms of, things that we should be doing to avert the climate crisis. And they were things like changes to agriculture, land use, and ideas around that, which in and of itself, I think is necessary. However, I don't think that that's obviously going to, be the solution to this problem in its totality. And for me, the arguments against sort of this reduction in resource usage that's quite common in terms of discussions around climate change runs up against a number of challenges when you start considering the current distribution of people, resources, and energy usage across the world. Now, you can do a classic division of the world according to global north and global south. And if you do that for the roughly 8 billion people that live on the world now, you'll find that 1 in 4 of those people live in the global north. And only they account for 80% of the world's financial resources. They also consume way over more than half of the world's energy. If you look at the global south, about 1 in 3 people, they still live in extreme poverty. And the people who are kind of middle income also have aspirations to improve their standards of living. So we are sitting with a situation where there are still billions of people across this world that aspires for a better quality of living. And that includes the consumption of more resources, desire to want to travel more, and to experience a quality of life akin to what people in the global north experience. And I personally don't think that that's an unreasonable request. People generally do want an improved quality of life. I'm not saying that it needs to be the excesses of what some northern global north countries indulge in, but I do think that there's improvements that a lot of people would like to make in their lives, and that would come at the expense of consuming more energy. So this call for a global reduction in energy use, I don't think is necessarily a realistic one. It's one that's kind of at odds with our desire to keep a trajectory of development and uplifting people out of extreme poverty. So that then brings us to this whole issue of people who make a similar argument to me, saying, well, that's one of the reasons we can't transition over to renewables, because renewables have limits, there are problems with renewables, and if we want to continue on this growth trajectory, we have to set aside this desire to become 100% renewable and really have this mixed use, or still, propagate the use of hydrocarbons and fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. And I'm sure if a lot of the energy companies could have their way until these resources completely run out. But as we saw with that governmental report from the UN, that's really not an option that we can kind of continue on. But is this claim true around the renewables? And there's just some data that I want to share with you around that, and then you kind of can decide. And so when I started looking at this problem, for me, the big question was, well, how much energy do we actually use as humanity? So this is everything we use for transport, industry, heating, electricity, the whole shebang. And there's some interesting estimates that have been done on this by, the World Bank and other organizations. But essentially what we are using every year as humanity is 0.6 zetajoules of energy. Now, zeta is a number with 21 zeros behind it, so it's a massive, massive number. It's an unfathomable amount of energy if you start breaking it down in terms of what a joule actually means. And it seems like a very, very, extreme amount of energy. But when you start looking at relative to other things, there are some interesting sort of patterns that start to emerge. So of that 0.6 zetajoules that we are consuming, and this data is now a little bit dated, but it hasn't changed radically. About 75% or 70% of that is still from traditional non-renewable electricity sources, and the rest is coming from renewable. You can see here hydro still makes up the bulk of that, and these ratios have changed somewhat, but not a great deal. The encouraging thing is that these ratios have increased. I first started looking at this data back in 2008, and there's been a 14% increase already in the use of renewables. But obviously the pace of change here is a bit slow. For us to meet our targets of making radical changes within the next decade, we can't afford for this to go up to 50% over the next 10 years. It needs to go up to 90% over the next 10 years. So that really calls for some radical changes, right? So if you look then at the breakdown of this 0.6 zetajoules that we use currently, about 25%, 24% of that's coming from renewables. The rest is coming from our traditional sort of fossil fuel and nuclear sources, coal, gas, oil, and nuclear. Now, if we think about what that actually means in terms of fossil fuels, at present, one of the studies that I came across, estimates that we are burning about half a millennia's worth of ancient biomatter. So that's biomatter that existed over 5 centuries every year. So from the time that Vladimir Putin invaded the Ukraine to now, is about the equivalent biomass that has grown on the planet since the first explorers circumnavigated the planet. So that's 500 years worth of sort of sunlight reaching the planet, biomass, turning that into oil over many, many millennia. So it's really a bit of an inefficient way to generate energy. And if you start thinking about it that way, 1 liter of petrol equals 23.5 tons of ancient organic matter that has been rendered through time, right? That is crazy. If you were to put that in the equivalent of horses, it's a bit of a macabre comparison, but you know, that would be the number of horses that would have to be kind of decayed in order to make this 1 liter of petrol. Now, if you wanted to fill up the tank of even just a small car, this is the number of kind of equivalent of organic matter that you would have to time render to fill the tank of 1 car. So the unsustainability of hydrocarbons and fossil fuels really kind of become a little bit more apparent when you start thinking about it in terms of these figures. We are just simply living on borrowed time. But then one of the arguments that you always hear is like, oh, but there isn't really enough energy that's coming from renewable sources. So question then is, well, how much energy is available from renewable sources if we were to be able to harness it? And remember, I mentioned in the beginning that we are merely using 0.6 zetajoules of energy. And if we were to harness all of the available renewable energy that's out there, we would be able to harness much more energy. And what I'm showing you here over the course of these 2 slides is all of the renewable energy that's available to us every year from the various renewable energy sources. In fact, we have 4,851 zetajoules of energy available to us from renewable sources, or about 8,000 times our current planetary requirement every year. So it's really not a question that there's a shortage of renewables out there. And I guess the question that will then naturally pop into your head is, well, where's all this energy coming from? Well, there are 3 primary sources of renewable energy. I'm sure you guys are familiar with solar. There's geothermal and there's celestial. And when it comes to solar, we've got direct and indirect solar energy. So we've got photovoltaics, and the rest of these renewable sources, wind, hydro, biomass, wave, all of this is actually solar energy that's just been converted into kinetic energy or rain or, you know, plant growth. And we are just reclaiming that solar energy out of these sources. But prior, they just solar energy. And in fact, coal, oil, and gas is also really solar energy that's just been trapped in hydrocarbons many millennia and centuries ago. So all of these are kind of you know, sources of solar energy, but these are the renewable ones that we are interested in. And of that, every year, planet receives 2,850 zetajoules of energy from the sun. Right? And remember, again, we're interested in 0.6 of zetajoules of energy, which is a fraction of what. So how much solar energy would we have to capture in terms of the Earth's surface to power the entire planet? Well, assuming we've got, you know, perfectly efficient solar panels, it would be literally this little square here. It would be the equivalent of capturing the sunlight that's reaching a country the size of Israel. So, you know, these vast amounts of solar energy available. We'd only have to capture about 0.02% of the available solar energy to kind of power our needs. In terms of geothermal, so we all know as the deeper we go on into the Earth's crust, the warmer it gets. You can use that geothermal energy to kind of heat things. And in fact, there's already a lot of countries that take advantage of their shallow geothermals. If you look at Iceland and other countries, they use their geysers and other geothermal sources to have these kind of steam power stations. But there's interesting technologies available around this for geothermal. And you can generate, they estimate up to, with current technology, about 2,000 zetajoules a year of geothermal. And with more advanced technology, there's up to 13,000 zetajoules available just off geothermal. So this obviously works better for some countries than others. And yes, there are some problems with geothermal, but again, all we're looking for is a small fraction of what's available. So in terms of all of the available geothermal energy that's out there, we are literally looking for that little cup of tea in terms of being able to power our needs. Then there's celestial energy, and all of us probably understand, you know, how the tides work. and the movement of the moon, and that kind of shifts our planet's oceans around, and that kinetic energy of the water also holds energy potential. And there's estimates out there that there's about 1 zettajoule of energy available just from tidal energy. So, you know, that's 40% more than we actually need every year to power our current needs. So the argument that, you know, there isn't sufficient renewable sources out there to power the planet really isn't one that holds up. So the outstanding issues there then is, okay, well, what about generation? It costs too much to generate this energy. And the other part of it is like, okay, well, renewables, especially if you look at sources like solar, they don't appear to be consistent. So we've got the problem with day-night, we've got the problem with weather and it being cloudy. Anybody who's got a solar system will know that foul weather will kind of, you know, curb your production of energy quite significantly. But let's look at the first part of this equation, which is really to do with the production. Now, if you were to ask the question, which is the cheapest way of generating electricity currently, some would say, oh, it's still coal, it's still gas, but that's in fact not true. The levelized cost per megawatt hour is now cheaper to use wind and solar and large photovoltaics than it is to use coal and gas. So the production isn't actually the argument anymore. The long-term sort of costs of these fuel sources and also of maintaining that infrastructure, you find that the renewable sources actually come out the winner in terms of cost of production. So you can see here that this is a cost that's also been dropping consistently. And things like wind and solar are just becoming cheaper and cheaper as these technologies have begun to mature, manufacturing has begun to mature, and these things are starting to reach scale. And we're enjoying economies of scale on these production methods. The problem with both wind and solar, though, is that it is not a consistent source of energy, right? The wind stops blowing, the sun is not always today. If you're in Port Elizabeth today, you look out the window, it's pretty gray. So that's the big problem. So it's not really the production side of the argument that's holding up anymore. This argument that you know, it's just too expensive to harness the sun and the wind for our energy needs. That's not true. And we know there's an abundance of energy. However, the one argument that still is valid and that is a problem has got to do with the storage of this energy. So we are producing often when we harness solar energy more than we can use, and then what happens to that energy? And ideally, what you would do is you would store that energy potential and then release it into grids and system as and when it's needed. And that's really where the problem comes in now. So the graph that you're looking at here is really got to do with the amount of energy that's available from different sources based on their volume and their weight. And especially if you start looking at transportation industries and all sorts of other things, you want something that's got is fairly dense and that can store a lot of energy. And if you get on a plane and you fly from, I don't know, Johannesburg to London, that 10-hour flight requires a fuel source that can kind of run for a very long time, but also will allow an aircraft to stay in the air. Now, the truth is that our current battery technologies are not anywhere close to where hydrocarbons are, the stuff that we typically use to power automobiles and aircraft and lots of other things. Hydrocarbons are actually pretty good when it comes to their energy capacity in terms of volume and weight. I don't know if anybody's ever picked up like a 5-kilo can of petrol versus a 5-kilo can of water, right? It's quite a difference. And that's why these are sort of really impressive fuel sources. Now, the most popular battery solution out there at the moment is our lithium-ion batteries. And that's really, if you look, that's way down here. So there's still a significant gap in terms of where we are with battery technologies and where we need to be in terms of to be competitive with the hydrocarbons that are out there at the moment. And that is really a gap that needs to be crossed if we are going to have solutions that will kind of complete this energy equation where we've got enough energy resources, we've now got the price of production down. The next problem that we're trying to solve is storage. And there's lots of different sort of options out there for energy storage. I'm just talking about the battery one because I think this is the one that presents the biggest hurdle for us at the moment. Now, there's all sorts of theoretical batteries out there, like lithium bromide, lithium sodium, and there's a long list of different ones that people have been experimenting with in laboratories. They keep running up against sort of technical challenges, and there really just needs to be a push, I think, towards moving us into a different sort of phase of development of these technologies. Now, when it comes to batteries, you really have to balance off a whole different set of trade-offs. So there's the energy density that I've spoken about. Then there's also how much energy, how much it's going to cost, how often can you reuse these batteries, how long is their shelf lives, temperature, how fast they charge. So there's a whole myriad of engineering trade-offs that need to be taken into consideration in the design of these. But this is really a technical challenge that I think we as humanity have to kind of look at very seriously. And that sort of feeds into this, just to show you again, this is the comparison with lithium ion and their kind of density and their volume, where we are at the moment with our battery technologies versus a lot of other fuel sources. One thing I found interesting here was body fat is a pretty damn efficient store of energy. And maybe we should just go to some of these liposuction clinics and we'll have an infinite supply of very efficient energy that we can harness. But jokes aside, this issue of dealing with battery density and efficiency and all the other engineering challenges that comes with batteries, the US Department of Energy is predicting that, just through the natural progress of industry, there will be a gradual sort of increase in the battery density and weight. And of course, there are companies out there that have a very big incentive to try and improve battery technologies, right? So Tesla is also working, Samsung is working, Apple, any company that's really got these kind of devices or electric cars or trucks, everybody is concerned about coming up with battery solutions. Also these large grid storage solutions. However, the pace of change there is being slow, and it's also something that is very, very disjointed. So there'll be a breakthrough in a little lab in China. There's something that happens at Rice University, the usual academic processes or conferences, people talking, and change is happening. I actually have a Google alert set up for breakthrough in battery technologies. On a weekly basis, I'm receiving articles of, small little changes and improvements that are being made in battery technologies. And I mean, I think we can all even feel it. If you've bought a new phone recently, you'll probably find that your smartphone is lasting a lot longer. And that's because of these sort of small improvements that have been made in these technologies. Now, these improvements, though, currently I don't think is moving at a pace that's going to meet our decade target for really making renewables a sustainable solution for us going forward. And if you look at the equation of currently of how we are working with energy globally, the global energy economy, from what I've seen from the IMF, is worth about $8 trillion annually. Now, we know that about a quarter of that's going to renewables, but that means that $6 trillion is still going to the fossil fuel industry. And what's much worse about this is that about $500 billion is going in subsidies to the fossil fuel industry globally annually. And that is, $500 billion that's being given to them to, keep energy costs low and more competitive. But the other more shocking figure is that about $5 trillion worth of externalities hit planet Earth every year as a consequence of the use of fossil fuels. And I'm talking about the devastating effects of droughts, floods, storms that are just continuing to get much, much, much more worse. And I mean, even recently looking at some of the flooding that's happened across the world and all of the expenses, you think about the destruction of property and assets that tally up to an immense amount of money that we as humanity are currently having to spend every year to combat the direct effects of climate change. So this is a vast amount of resources that's currently being somewhat misdirected, in my opinion. And so I think for me, the equation really boils down to this. We need to stop fossil fuel subsidies. We need to place, I think, a more substantial tax on fossil fuels to combat the expense of these externalities. And these funds need to go towards a global public energy storage solutions project. Now, this kind of comes to the point of my talk is like, well, why should it be public? Why can't we just leave this to the private sector to keep working on? And I think if you look historically at instances where humanity have faced crises and you bring a group of experts together and you get them to really focus and work on solving a particular problem, we've had some success. And one of the examples is the Manhattan Project that happened between 1942 and 45. And they got a group of some of the world's smartest physicists together, stuck them in the desert, and within 3 years, they had cracked nuclear fusion and they were making atomic weapons. They did all of this with about 130,000 people who were all involved in this project in the end at a cost of about $40 billion. Now, that's, of course, I'm using this example for dramatic effect because you know, the outcome of that was obviously not necessarily desirable for humanity. But there are other examples also of when we've done this historically. The German Enigma machine was something that was also a massive headache for the Allied forces during the Second World War. And they turned to a small group of people to crack this uncrackable machine. And a team led by Alan Turing at Bletchley Park in the UK broke the code in less than 6 months using technologies that they invented during that period. So there is something to be said for kind of really concentrated efforts to tackle technical challenges. So this now circles back to what I raised in the beginning around, well, why is the psychologist talking about this? And why shouldn't we leave things to industry necessarily? And this kind of goes back, and I think it's nicely symbolized by this particular experiment. What you see here in front of you is a candle, a box with thumbnails and some matches. And what they did, this experiment goes all the way back to the 1950s, was to ask people in a laboratory setting to take this candle and to suspend it against the wall somehow, and then to light it with the match so that no part of the candle touched the table on which they were working. So I'm going to leave you for a moment to think about, okay, there's a board that you can put thumbtacks in. How would you go about solving this problem of suspending this candle against the wall so that no part of it touches the ground? Okay, I know my audience here today is very quick, and I know most of you already have the solution. So this is an experiment that they ran under many different conditions. And interestingly enough, one of the conditions was under a condition of competition. So they say to a group of participants, hey, we're going to rank your performance on this task, and we're going to incentivize you financially to kind of come up with a solution for this problem really quickly. And in today's money, that would be the equivalent of almost 2,000 Rand prize money for the person who got it the quickest. And then there was a descending rate of prizes that people would get based on their performance. There was another experimental group where they just said to them, you know, here's an interesting problem, go ahead and solve it. which of those two groups do you think actually performed better at this task? The group that was sort of operating under this financial incentive, or the group who was doing it just for the curiosity of trying to solve this problem? Well, as it turns out, the group that were financially incentivized did much worse than the group who did it just for the curiosity of the problem. And they've replicated this experiment over many decades. In fact, they ran these experiments from the early 50s all the way through to the 1970s. And reliably, they kept finding that as soon as you introduced the financial incentive for this experiment, the groups performed more poorly in terms of outcomes, meaning a smaller percentage of people were able to solve the problem, and the ones who did solve it took a lot longer to do it. Now, for those of you curious about the solution, well, all you do is you take a thumbtack, you stick the box onto the wall, and then you put the candle in it. And what others were doing was trying to use the thumbtacks, melt it into wax, and then try and spin it on the wall, and none of that would work. But this is the simplest and quicker solution to this problem. Now, this speaks to a kind of a philosophy when it comes to innovation that I think we really need when it comes to tackling the storage solution problem. I think we as humanity would really benefit from taking some of our current top battery scientists and engineers, sticking them in the desert somewhere ideally. That seems to be the place where most of these problems get solved, and then get them to focus on this problem of much higher energy density, longer lifespan, and faster charging batteries. And there's some steps, obviously, and things that need to be involved in that. But in terms of the available timelines that we have, if we redirect some of the resources that we're currently using just on fossil fuels expenditure and get a group of people to really focus their attention on this particular problem, I think this is going to accelerate the solution of this problem significantly. If we leave the current problem exclusively to the private sector, which seems to be the case right now, it's going to be much longer before we see an outcome to this that's going to help us address the current problems. So I'm going to leave you with this quote. I think this moment represents an incredible opportunity to unite the world as one and to embrace our shared humanity, not as nationals of this country or that country, but as a citizen of planet Earth, a shared celestial life support system hurling through space in a vast, ever-expanding universe. The problems of our world are fixable. The only thing standing in our way is ourselves. Good. Thanks for your attention. I will now open it up to comments, questions. Please go ahead.
Fantastic. Thanks, Anton. And thanks for a very challenging one. Is there anyone who has a question? Whilst people think about it, Anton, what I was thinking about is that when you showed the picture of the solar panel in the center of the Sahara, that was significant enough for us to power the entire world, is that if you had enough of those around the globe, you could track the sun. But that would require something else that's come out in your presentation here, is this thing about collaboration. And if we look at our recent experience with COVID-19, where we had the solution, but it wasn't equitably resourced across the world, I mean, how do we perhaps storage is not our biggest problem, but collaboration is our biggest problem. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's always the big thing. And I mean, somebody like Alex who's here will probably be better suited to speaking about the challenges around the global cooperation around climate issues, and also the issues around climate justice, right? So I raised this issue around the global north and south at the opening of my talk, but there's obviously a lot more complexities around that. And you've had a group of nations who have for a century benefited from the exploitation of hydrocarbons extensively, have built very powerful economies off the back of that, has contributed to this climate change problem. And you've got a group of countries in the global south who want to catch up, but they're not allowed now to use the same technologies. And I think there is a legitimate conversation that needs to be had around the redistribution of kind of resources and the challenges around ensuring that these transitions in the global south happen, not only at their own expense. But this issue around cooperation in terms of generation of energy. So as you mentioned there, the tracking of the sun around the world, there's some other challenges that brings to bear, right? So the transportation of energy is always a challenge. So even if you were to be generating energy in Sahara, it's going to be dark in Los Angeles. How do you get the energy there? So it's as far as I've looked at it, there's just no ways of getting out of this conversation around storage, and that energy density versus energy volume and storage is just a technical challenge that we are going to have to deal with. And then the question becomes, how do we deal with it? And this is what I think is a way of approaching it. There might be others. Any other questions?
I see Andrea has a question there. Andrea, do you want to?
Yes, sorry about that. It's just following on again from I think this whole idea of collaboration. So the question was just, as a psychologist, which you call yourself, how do you think you could get Russian and Chinese and American scientists to all join each other in the desert? Now, because it would have to be now, wouldn't it?
Yes, it has to happen fairly quickly. I think if you speak to the average scientist in any country, their driving motivation is really curiosity. If you're a true scientist, you're a curious person. And curious people want to be around other curious people, and they want to solve problems. So the only thing that's standing in the way really from that happening is resources and the political will. So the people who control those scientists and the things that they work on. So the collaboration really is this collaboration of nations that need to happen to make the resources and to authorize those people to kind of go to these places. But in terms of the individuals, the people who I think have the technical know-how to really solve a problem like this, if you put them all together, there might be some interesting dynamics, but I don't foresee there being a problem in terms of addressing the actual problem. That was one of the wonderful things I experienced working in the UN, where I at one point had a team consisting of people from about 20 different nations. We were all pulling in the same direction, and there was never really anything that got in the way from us working towards that. So yeah, the psychology of it at the scientist level, I don't think is an issue at all. It's really just the resources and the governments agreeing that that is the approach that needs to be taken.
So that's really depressing.
Yeah, I suppose there is a little bit. Yeah, the current state of geopolitics, especially with the split between the East and the West, it would be ideal if we could all kind of pull together. But then again, I think there are enough brilliant minds in the West and in the East to kind of, if they were to maybe tackle this, as the bipolar world model, and put together projects to try and to beat each other, maybe a bit of healthy competition between these two groups, like the good old space race we had during the Cold War. It just needs to emerge as a priority for these groups.
Okay, thank you.
Anton, maybe just a follow-up question. Having spent 10 years or more in the UN universe, with this latest report, which is a synthesis report. So I don't know if people understand that synthesis reports aren't a scientific report per se. Is what they take is they take the scientific document and they render it into a summary for policy makers. And so the countries are allowed to then give comment in that. And it's my understanding that Saudi Arabia insisted that they take out the whole thing around fossil fuels causing the problem, and that Brazil and Argentina, I think, took out the whole thing about dairy and beef being unsustainable, and that we should switch to vegetable sources of food. So I was wondering, in terms of the UN environment, whether you are ever able to overcome the vested interests that sort of block this. If you look at Saudi Arabia in terms of its size and population, and that compared to the rest of the world, should it be allowed that kind of leverage? Because it's in the interest of humanity and the planet that we get this thing resolved.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a really interesting point there, and I've actually, I think a while ago I did a talk around this issue of sovereignty and the United Nations. The UN was set up in a time in history that the world looked very different, and it had a very different set of challenges than it has today. And if you look at the UN Charter and the way that it's written, sovereignty reigns supreme in that document. I mean, the first point made in the Charter is that no body or nation can override anything that within a sovereign state. That's the supreme ruling and decision body. So as long as that is the founding tenet of the UN is always at the behest then of what individual sovereign states want. And in an era of 1945, yeah, maybe that made sense. But I think now, the point in history that we're facing now, we've got certain intractable global problems where that particular way that the Charter is written is not useful. And it's not going to help us advance as humanity. Because you can have a ruler like Bolsonaro, for instance, in Brazil, who just wreaked havoc on the rainforests, which is very important carbon trap and is really important to not just Brazil's ecology, but to the global ecology. And so you do kind of want it to be in a situation where if individual nations are misbehaving, that there is more power and clout in a body like the UN to say to them, hey, the stuff that you're doing, even though you're a member of this global community, you're messing it up for the rest of us. And that is a problem, and that's something that needs to be addressed. But the way that structure, that organization is constituted, it's got no mechanism, nothing, to try and address these transgressions. So yeah, maybe it's up to our generation to start thinking about, well, what could other bodies or future bodies look like, and what needs to be fixed in the current charter to try and address these shortcomings. Because I do think it's a massive issue. Because yeah, these reports are always going to be watered down versions because of this effect that you've now mentioned, people taking out things. And then the other things is that if you were to ask these scientists to give their true estimates of things, I think they'd probably tell you it's much more dire than that report says. But there's always a desire to make these reports sound a little bit more upbeat, and that there's a solution just around the corner kind of thing, and we just need to do X and Y. But I think that's them playing to the public a little bit in terms of like, well, we can't be too dire on this, the messaging of this. So that also factors into it. But yeah, that's another conversation. That's stuff around reform of the UN, which I think is definitely, we've reached the point in history where that's needed.
Awesome, thanks, Anton. So one of the key challenges for us is how, the mechanism of collaboration. How do we do that, and how do we encourage people, the actors that are not willing to participate? How do we encourage them? Alex, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to ask a question?
Yeah, thanks. And sorry, I won't turn on my camera. I've been having device difficulties if you're seeing multiple versions of me jumping in and out. Thanks, Anton. A really interesting talk. I kind of have one point that agrees with you, and then another point that maybe pushes back a little bit on an element. So the point that agrees with you is the work of Mariana Mazzucato, who's an economist, and she basically points out that a lot of our technological innovations historically have been funded by the public sector. And then what happens is the private sector kind of cannibalizes and privatizes the innovations and profiteers of it. And I think Elon Musk is a pretty stunning example of that. A lot of public innovation went into and subsidies went into his work. And then he tries to paint himself as the self-made man. And I wonder from a psychological standpoint, whether part of what we're facing is a neoliberal ideology that prevents us from recognizing that properly, and one that's driven by corporations. There's another struggle there. And then on the storage front, yeah, I mean, I think innovations in storage are vitally important, and I'm all for the Manhattan Project. But I also wonder, there are some thinkers like Mark Jacobson at Stanford who think that we have a lot of the technologies we need, and that, you know, storage plays an important role, but a lot of what we can do is things like large transmission grids. So even if the sun's not shining here, the wind will be blowing over there. And so that our storage needs may not be as significant. But I guess this is a technical issue of disagreement to a certain extent, but I think it doesn't negate the need for a Manhattan project, but it might mean that we can do a lot with the technologies that we already have in the meantime anyway. All right. Thanks.
Thanks,
Yeah,
Alex.
Absolutely, Alex. So the issue around sort of the neoliberal model and the impacts that has on innovation and how that all gets absorbed in, it's a completely valid point. And that's kind of one of the reasons, yeah, as you said, you agree with me, why I think it's important that there be a publicly funded push for innovation on this front. In terms of the issue of smart grids, yeah, absolutely. I think every tool that we have in the toolbox, we need to throw at this problem. It's just, I think there are countries that are pretty well positioned to be able to take advantage of things like that, and then there are others that aren't. And so we probably will need a mix of tools to try and solve this issue, including storage and you know, far more intelligent transmission systems and such. So thanks for that.
Thanks, Anton.
Thanks, Anton. Anyone else have a question there? So as you think about it, Anton, you know, as I listen to what you're talking about, I think that there's sort of two key areas. One is the technological area, in terms of how do you produce it in the quantities, consistent quantities that we consume it in. You know, energy, I think the underlying premise is that we can't do without energy in our modern lifestyles. That's not a possibility that will go off grid. But, you know, so there's the technological stuff, and then there's the, call it the interrelationship stuff, the stuff between nations and people, in terms of that those that have an advantage through fossil fuels at this point in time are not necessarily going to give up that advantage to benefit other nations through that process. You know, so there's still very much a sort of competitive spirit that exists there. I mean, I think the United Nations, whilst it doesn't have any sort of tools to enforce, well, I mean, to a limited extent, diplomacy is a very, very effective tool that does do that, you know, the willing sign-on. But for instance, the ICC, you know, International Criminal Court, America is not part of that, you know, so you can never, you know, you're not going to get Bush to come to the ICC, you know, and, you know, and if you look at a number of these agreements, countries opt out of the ones that they're going to find tough to implement back home, you know, so yeah, so I mean, I think it's those two areas that we're going to have to be looking at, and probably maybe a third one is just the economic model on which we run the world at the moment. You know, in terms of what Alex is saying, is that the neoliberal sort of capitalist thing, and I'm not sure if this recent initiative, there's an initiative in South America to have a singular currency, and then there's also talks between Russia and China and the BRICS to de-dollarize the world economy, whether that will aid anything. But yeah, I mean, that seems to be the sort of three key areas: the technological, the social, and then the economic, that we have to unpack and resolve in order to get us through this next sort of growth point, if you want to put it that way.
You're
Awesome.
absolutely.
Yeah.
So yeah, you're absolutely right, Gary. I agree with all three of those issues. I mean, my talk today was really about how do we tackle that technical challenge, and what is a potential solution for that. The other two issues around the economics and the politics are interesting ones. So the economics, currently the estimates out there, $6 trillion being spent on energy every year, just on fossil fuels, not the whole energy equation. That is a vast amount of money.
Yeah.
You know, that is a vast sum of resources that we as humanity are directing towards the extraction, the refining, and the use of fossil fuels for our energy purposes. And it's hard for me not to imagine a world where you take that $6 trillion and you start directing it towards renewables. Now, the problem with that renewable equation is that you can't charge people for sunshine. You can't charge them for wind. You can charge them for something you can hold, like coal or oil or gas. And I think that's one of the sort of weird things about this transition to this renewable model is that the economics of it isn't quite as sweet, if you like, as it was with the fossil fuel industry. So it means really that all investment goes into the construction of this infrastructure, but once that infrastructure is up and running, it's really just maintenance and gradual sort of upkeep of that infrastructure to kind of to make use of the production. But it does free up a huge amount of resources for us to do other things throughout humanity, which I think is very tempting and interesting. But yeah, it is $1 million question, is how do you reconfigure that equation in a way that makes it attractive? And maybe, as Alex pointed out, it is a shift away from the pure neoliberal kind of profit model, and thinking about this in a different way. Maybe energy production and distribution should just be a public good.
Awesome, thanks, Anton. Glenn, I see you had your hand up.
Thanks so much, Gary, and thank you, Anton, for a wonderful talk. The talk really struck my interest when you mentioned batteries, because I've been somebody who's also been looking at the price of batteries because of the current energy crisis in the country, looking at solar batteries and so forth. And I wanted you, because you've got a bit of time now, could you just take me through what has been the evolution of batteries? To me, it seems so bizarre that there are things like the Manhattan Project, the Enigma code, which has been cracked, the military-industrial complex running fantastic things like that, it seems so bizarre that the evolution of a battery has stalled somehow. What has that process been? Where do you see it going? And what is the affordability prospects look like? Because I'm interested in the ordinary Joe on the ground who's going to need batteries to store energy because there's a global energy crisis. Will batteries ever become affordable? Is it the price of the battery which makes the cell phone so expensive? Talk me through these things as someone who's not as clued up. But thanks again for a great talk.
No worries. Glenn, I'm by no means a battery expert, but I'll certainly kind of talk you through my understanding of how this equation sort of works. And if you were to look at batteries that we had 20 years ago versus today, there's actually been quite a dramatic improvement, not only in the time that it takes to charge a battery, the amount of times that a battery can be recharged before it fails. So there've been all these little incremental improvements that have happened in battery technologies. But lithium-ion batteries were like the last major technological breakthrough that we had. And if you think about the life cycle of coming up with a new technology, there's all of the R&D that's usually done through public universities and some companies that are working on these issues. And once they've come up with a technology that they think is viable, there are two issues that immediately then come up. Is this battery made from a natural resource that is abundantly available and cheap? And the other thing is, can this battery be manufactured at a price point that makes sense once you start doing it at scale? Now, there are batteries out there that, you know, are more efficient and more effective than lithium ion, but they're made from elements that are not very widely available, and the manufacturing processes are very challenging to kind of produce at scale. So that immediately becomes like a no-go in terms of further extension of those technologies. They're used for very specialized purposes. But there are theoretical batteries out there, like the lithium sodium and the bromide batteries that I spoke about earlier, that these resources are relatively abundantly available. There's even talk about theoretical sodium batteries. So there's all sorts of interesting things out there that people have even started working with in labs and have found that these things are technically possible, but as soon as you start working with batteries and recharging, there's all sorts of issues around what they call dendrites around the anodes that start emerging. There's chemical processes and things that become quite complex in terms of the sustainability and lifespan of these batteries. So then you as a battery scientist have to not only come up with these sort of elements, ingredients for the battery, but you also have to put it together in a way that this battery then operates optimally over a long period of time. It can be manufactured cheaply, and it can operate at a range of temperatures, and it's not something that's going to expire. So, you know, that really, as an engineer or as a scientist, you've got to balance a lot of different elements off. However, given the interest in energy storing solutions, and I think especially as the electric vehicle markets start reaching a certain kind of maturity, and I was fortunate that I just spent a few weeks in America earlier this year, and I was in California, and it's encouraging to see the number of electrical vehicles, for instance, in that state now on the roads. And a friend of mine in Norway was explaining to me that if you go to Oslo now, almost every car on the road there is a Tesla. So there is a demand, and I think as more and more manufacturers transition over to this idea of electric vehicles, we are going to see more rapid natural increases and improvements in battery technology and a drop in price. It's just a little bit too slow for the kind of challenges that we're facing at present with climate change. One final question I saw just popped in here was from Andrea. What about the dealing with the recycling of batteries? So what happens if the life cycle of one of these devices is matured and you need to get rid of it? There's already companies out there that are buying up, especially lithium-ion batteries en masse, and they've got processes in place to extract that lithium back out, and they are in an environmentally friendly way kind of processing these batteries. So I think that's one of the elements that will have to be added to the equation in terms of when you're thinking through a storage solution, is what happens at the end of that life cycle with that device. Are we left with something toxic that's going to destroy the planet? If that's the conclusion, even if it's a great battery, then that may be not the direction we want to go. Okay, one final question from Mareka, and then I think we'll be up at time.
Go for it, Mareka. Ask a question.
Thank you so much, Anton, for a very insightful, presentation on the storage for renewable energy, especially. Mine is not necessarily a question, but a comment, which hopefully I think it's something that we've been trying to explore when it comes to socially owned renewables, what it means, especially as we are trying, to mainstream, socially owned renewables within the South African policy environment. We're trying to advocate for that, so that at least we don't set up communities for failure, and we can be able to address such issues, because, I think during the process of being involved in this project, we are coming up with a lot of brick walls, where people are quick to mention how it's not possible because our communities are incapable of running community IPPs, for instance. They don't have the technical know-how, the financial know-how, or even resources for that matter. Now, the issue of storage, now, it also comes into the mix, as well. So, yeah, maybe we'll probably pick up, I'll pick your brain outside of this session as well as we continue, I think, developing the pilot projects nationally. Thank you.
No, that's a good point, Mareka. And, energy storage can be done in ways that don't require super advanced technologies. You can use compressed air. You can use water to store energy potential. There's all sorts of innovative ways to go about this that I think can be leveraged in a context like South Africa. It requires a bit of will and a bit of innovation. But I think we're up on time. Gary, over to you.
Awesome. Anton, thank you very much. And thank you for that. I think one of the key themes that we're going to have to explore during this thing is how do those that have the advantage not amplify the advantage going forward, and that comes to social community-based projects, is how do you manage that? How do you make it happen? So thank you everyone to your input. Thank you for the questions, and Anton, thank you especially to you for the Manhattan Project 2.0. We look forward, hopefully, somewhere in the Sahara Desert, somewhere in Africa, not in America necessarily. But Angie, I think that you have a couple of last things to say. And then to everyone else, thank you very much.
Okay, yes, thanks, Gary. Thanks, everyone. Just quickly, if you miss a seminar, if you want to send a seminar to friends, people who might be interested, they will all be recorded. They are on YouTube, and links are available. You can just email me for them or find them in some other way. And then next week, we will be chatting to Alex Lenferner about privatization, inequality, and renewable revolutions. So hopefully we will be continuing this conversation, and it will be an accumulative, very interesting, but somewhat at this stage alarming topic to be talking about. But thanks everyone, and have a great weekend, and we will see you hopefully all next week.
Awesome. Thanks, Andrea. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Anton.
Thanks everyone. Bye.
Bye.